My name is David Chard. I'm the Dean of the Wheelock College of Education and Human Development here at Boston University. And it's my pleasure, and actually I'm quite excited about today's discussion that's entitled Colleges for Everybody, Creating Welcoming Campuses. And this series is really deeply rooted in our ongoing efforts to create a more equitable and just society through education and human development. Each discussion will focus on the complexity of an issue and seek to uncover the sort of transformational opportunities to see students and communities thrive. Now, let me get to our featured speaker and introduce to you my colleague, Dr. Anthony Abraham Jack. I'm pleased that Tony has joined our faculty here at BU Wheelock. Dr. Jack is a sociologist and professor of higher education leadership at BU Wheelock and the inaugural faculty director at the Newberry Center. That's BU's center that supports and celebrates first-generation students at Boston University. Dr. Jack's scholarship focuses on the gap between access and inclusion at elite universities that have expanded their recruitment of lower income and first-generation college students. His work has transformed policies and practices on university campuses around the world. His research has appeared in a variety of publications, and he has held several prestigious fellowships, including ones with the Ford Foundation and the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard. He has been featured in numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the New Yorker. He is the award-winning author of The Privileged Poor: How Elite Colleges Are Failing Disadvantaged Students. His second book project, When Campus Closed: How Elite Colleges Are Still Failing Disadvantaged Students, is due out in August 2024, and that will be published by Princeton University Press. Dr. Jack joined BU Wheelock this fall after 7 years on the faculty at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. We are very excited to have Tony here today for this conversation, and very fortunate that he chose BU as his new base of scholarship, leadership, and advocacy. Tony, welcome. Please join me. Wonderful. And you're in the pink. I love it. Great to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
The format for these discussions is just that. I have a series of prepared questions that I'm going to engage Tony in, and I would encourage audience members to use the Q&A function. We're monitoring those questions that you're posting or comments, and if appropriate, I will thread them into our discussion. If not, we'll also leave plenty of time for questions to be answered later in the webinar. So, Tony, from the time I've gotten to know you, I've had the pleasure to learn about your work, and I know that the power of your scholarship is in your storytelling. And I want you to start, because there are probably people on the webinar who don't know you very well and want to know more about your research. So I'd love for you to start with sharing a bit about how you have found your way to your current faculty role here at BU.
Yeah. First of all, thank you for allowing me to address the larger Wheelock and BU community. Just kind of like finishing up my first semester here, still getting my my feet steady and getting to know the map of campus and trying to visit everything. I'm still waiting for my invitation to go up to the top of the bookcase. So putting that out there for anybody who knows anybody in the BU building. I still wait for my invite.
I can get you a tour. I can get you a tour of the building. I promise.
The thing I love about my research is, it's so much attached to my story. I'm a first generation college student, right? My mom is a security guard, was a security guard for 30 years at a middle school she helped to desegregate, right? So let's put that in history. And my brother is a janitor at my old elementary school and the hospital. So college was always something that we aspired for, right? We thought like, oh God, he's nerdy, he likes cartoons, he likes to read, he's good at math. He's probably going to go to school. So let's like clear the way as much as possible for him. But specific help on the road to college was generally absent for me. But I had the love and support. I was a fortunate first generation college student who had the love and support of his family to make it through. But I had certain roadblocks along the way, and that could have easily been a detour. And one in particular is when I was in high school, I had a football coach who liked athlete students, but didn't like student athletes. And
Hmm.
so I ended up having to uproot myself and go to another school so as to not be bullied in that way again. And that kind of hurt because I was a Head Start kid. I had been in public schools my entire life. I went to Coconut Grove Elementary, George Washington Carver, and Coral Gables Senior High School. There were people who I would have graduated with who I had known since I was 5 years old. But yeah, I had to uproot myself because I didn't want anyone else to put limitations on my own future. And when I went to Gulliver, which is a private school in Miami, for that 1 year, my senior year, a fateful phone call changed everything. Amherst called and said, "Hey, do you have someone who can make it past our admissions test?" And my coach said, "Yes, this year we do." I did not know that my individual detour through private school was actually a well-established on-ramp for students like me, for lower income students. Because what I learned over the course of the last 15 years is that elite colleges, as they were diversifying their campuses, they weren't going knocking on every door across the country. They weren't even going on most of the places. They were still going to elite boarding, day, and preparatory high schools for not only their full pay students, but their full ride students. And yet, when I got to graduate school, nowhere in the literature were people comparing the experience of those who went to public versus private school. When people wrote about first generation college students, they wrote of a single story of chronicling culture shock and isolation, of people at risk, of people who were punching above their weight. And yet, 50% on average of lower income Black students, like myself, 1/3 of lower income Latino students at elite colleges are the alumni of boarding, day, and preparatory high schools: Andover, Exeter, Deerfield, St. Paul, Choate, all these schools that cost $50,000 and $60,000 a year for high school. And so my research started long before I realized what I was doing, because I was just living. I was an 18-year-old trying to just make it to college. And then now all of a sudden I'm reflecting on my own personal experience. And so for the graduate students on this call, you may hear some researchers say, "Oh, I statements have no place in research." Some of the greatest innovations in research started because of a lived experience that did not align with what was the extant literature. And that lived experience pushed the boundaries of our own education and understanding. Because when you think about Mary Patillo's Black on the Block, when you think about Karen Lacey's Blue Chip Black, when you think about a lot of the research on neighborhoods that kind of painted with broad brushstrokes, when you think about when I think about my own work and how I'm trying to make a contribution, I introduce the privileged poor to the world. Lower income students who may be economically disadvantaged, but have high stocks of what people call cultural capital, those taken for granted ways of being that are valued in a particular context, right? They know about Tulum. They've flown on private jets. They've had the boarding school experience with teachers who have a PhD and teach the Harkness method, which is 4 or 5 students sitting around a table exchanging grand ideas about old books and things like that. And then when they get to schools like BU and Harvard and Amherst and Wesleyan, they're like, "This is deja vu. This is basically my high school, but bigger." So they come in knowing the rules of the game long before they got there. So my story was the foundation for my research. And I channeled this passion into an empirical question, right? I wanted to understand, how does social class direct students' trajectories through college, and investigating that question ever since.
Hmm. Wow. So Tony, I just have to tell you, someone has already asked when you're going to teach your first class and how do they get enrolled in it. So just, you can come back to that later. I'll let you answer that in the Q&A, but just to give you a sense of, people are waiting. So it's pretty clear from that story what has motivated your scholarship and your work. I want, and I know you've spent a lot of time studying and examining the histories and the systems kind of at the root of the experiences you describe in your work. I wonder if you can help us understand how those systems and policies that are in place on college campuses play out differently for students from different backgrounds. Um, and provide some examples, because
Yeah,
I
I
think
will.
I've heard you tell some of these stories, and it's very powerful.
Yeah, I want to give two examples, and I'll and because I want to talk about those practices that are so commonplace on campus that we don't quite think to ever explain them. And then I want to actually talk about some hard, like written rules of policies that then hurt students. Office hours are an example of a practice that is commonplace on campus, but we never really interrogate them truly. We always say when office hours are. We almost never say what they are.
Mhm.
Right? Office hours are a time in which faculty set aside to meet with students to discuss anything that that student wants to talk about, particularly what happens in that course. But if we don't take that extra step, and I hate to even call it extra, if we don't even take that step to explain it, then students who enter college already comfortable with faculty, with adults, with a sense of entitlement to an adult's time, energy, and expertise, those are the students who are more likely to go. And those are the students who are going to reap the benefits of going, even though they already come in ahead of other people. Office hours are where professors become advisors, advisors become mentors, and eventually even mentors become friends. The way in which you get, and it's not even about the social side, right? There is an academic benefit of going to office hours. There was a paper in a political science journal that actually looked at the frequency of office hours. There was a positive correlation with performance and office hour attendance. And it makes sense. You get to learn how a professor thinks, how they ask questions. I'll never forget when I was at Amherst, I had an organic chemistry professor, David Hanson, who had office hours at night because his daughter played a sport and he would always do pickup. No one else went but me. And so what he started to do is he started to bring two clementines. And on his desk every night was two clementines next to a piece of chalk. And he said, I have questions for you, and you're going to the board to answer them. We would peel the clementine and I would start answering the questions. And my grade started to go up in organic chemistry. And but I also felt seen. I also felt heard in that moment, and there was a greater connection to him than any other science professor that I had. It was like that kind of mutual thing. If we were to able to demystify the hidden curriculum, right, that system of unwritten rules and unsaid expectations, we could actually create a much more level playing field for students once they get into campus.
Mm.
Right? The way in which if a student know that they weren't, I talk about this in the book, that they weren't bothering a faculty member by going to office hours, or that they weren't inconveniencing someone, right? And it's not just faculty, librarians, mental health counselors, study abroad officers, right? Any adult in a position whose job it is literally to help students, who sit in their offices often twirl their thumbs, wishing more students would come and see them. But the students who would benefit the most won't go because they're afraid to, or they don't feel comfortable, or they more importantly and more commonly, they don't know that they should. And I think we can, and that's a practice that we need to, that's a something that we need to learn again, is that everyone had to learn how to ride a bike for the first time. Everybody had to learn how to jump off of something for the first time, whether it's whether you're going I don't go skiing. I get too much momentum going downhill for me. So whatever you're doing on a bike or ski board or whatever, right, you had to learn for the first time. Someone had to teach you. Why is that when it comes to college campus policies and practices, we're like, oh, your mom and dad been here before. Somebody can help you, right? That's literally the traditional, stereotypical way in which we do it. And the sad part is, on the flip side of the policy is, when students need our help the most, and they don't feel comfortable getting, they often struggle. And they struggle to the point that then they must take time off. And here again, we see a disproportionate harm done to lower income and first generation college students. Because if you look at, for example, policies about taking academic leave, if you want to take a voluntary leave, the only thing you have to do is email your dean and say, hey, I think I'm gonna go do an internship, or I don't want to come back this semester. You fill out a little paperwork at some schools, and that's basically it. But if you are like so many first generation and lower income students who persevere and push through, but life gets in the way because the phone calls you get at home keep coming. You're trying to work 2 or 3 jobs to not keep the fridge full, but at least not empty. You're trying to keep the lights on at home so that your little sibling can have access to the internet, or at least access to enough light to do their homework. And your grades begin to slip, but you don't reach out because you don't feel comfortable, and no one has taken that proactive step to welcome you to their office or to their service. And let's say you're more likely and you're asked to take time off. The way in which universities penalize students for that is sad, because they almost put you on parole. It's so akin to like welfare work requirements or parole guidelines. That's what it feels like when you read some of these university policies about what you have to do to come back to campus. And so they kick you off campus and say, go home. And they say, you have to work a full-time job and take classes. You have to write 2 essays about what you have persevered to overcome in your heart, or describe a hardship, or asking someone else to write a letter of recommendation about how you've handled something that was hard. But the problem is, if you come, that ignores context. Because if you come from a neighborhood that has a 50% unemployment rate, because you come from a rural community that the mines are closing, or you live near or on a reservation, or you live in any of America's cities that are struggling right now, you're going back to a place where even sometimes your parents or your family more generally can't find jobs or can't find work. And yet you want the boss to submit a letter of recommendation. So many of the students who I interviewed for my second book project were not only the first and only person in their family to go to college, they were but a few of their entire community to ever go to college, let alone the wider neighborhood. Not every boss can write a letter of recommendation. Not every boss knows the language or even has the proficiency to do that. And so how do we begin to like align our policies with reality? We're recruiting more lower income students. But even if that we're going to take a step away from the individual student for a second, we are admitting students from more disadvantaged communities and neighborhoods. We are admitting students from schools that are struggling. Now, I fundamentally believe that any and every student who is admitted to BU and admitted to so many of these universities can do the work. That doesn't mean that life does not disrupt academic processes. That doesn't mean that that 2 a.m. phone call that lower income students are disproportionately more likely to get, that says someone got shot, someone got stabbed, that someone got hurt at work, someone got. That is the calls that we are more likely to get, that take much more time to recover from, that you can't go back to reading sonnet number 74 so quickly. And so if we're not prepared to deal with that on the front end, because we're surely not prepared to do it on the back end when we punish students and make them do so much extra work to come back to campus. And so how do we reconcile not helping students avail themselves to the resources of campus that can help them manage emotions, manage transition, and manage relationships? And then now we can't even help them transition off campus. Because one thing I learned, and I'll stop, is that when universities do require students to leave, you lose access to university privileges. So no Office of Career Services, no job placement help. If you elect to go, not only do you still get access to those resources, you can still apply for summer grants when you return. So even when you elect to pause school for whatever reason you're doing it for, the school is still there for you. But if you stumble or struggle or trip, they tell you that you're on your own. And to me, that's not only an a progress that's not equal, it's nowhere near equitable, and it's nowhere near fair.
Wow. Let me start there. You open, so for a middle class white kid who went to school, I was also first gen, but I had family who had gone to school in front of me to kind of lead the way. But you open up so many ideas about things we don't know that we don't know, right? About our policies and issues of equity. So thank you for that. Let me so I want folks on the webinar to know that you joined BU in part to be part of the Wheelock community, but a major motivator for you was the Newberry Center. And
Yes.
I want you to talk a little bit about the Newberry Center and what your plans are there, working with Maria Erb, the director of the center, but also what your how you're hoping to use the Newberry Center to advance changes at BU.
Yeah. I think for me, this is the Newberry Center is both is a global local entity for me, because what I want to do is build on what Maria has done. And what the Newberry Center, and I've been researching it long before, throughout this whole process, it's been that touchstone point for so many students. It's been that it's almost like that safe space in playing tag, right? Like you there and you feel seen, you feel heard, you feel taken care of and thought of. And the question is, how do we turn those individual moments into policy? How do we turn what is being done on those Fuel Up Fridays and in the closing closet and in the support for advocating for students in different offices? How do we transform that into actual policies and practices? And the reason why I say global is, for those of you who don't know, the Ford Foundation decided to end its program of doctoral dissertation, and postdoctoral fellowships. And the thing about this is, if you could say one of the single programs that has helped diversify the professoriate, especially at the level of full professors, especially for Black, Latino, Native, and Asian faculty, the Ford Foundation is probably one of the single biggest driving forces in making that happen. And yet they decided to close it. And I was very saddened by that. And on top of that, the Supreme Court decided to reverse the statement about affirmative action, about taking race into consideration. Those two things were a huge blow for the possibility of continuing to me, too slow, but at least diversification of the academy writ large, at the faculty, staff, and administrative levels. I believe that we have potential to fill in a little bit of that gap by actually supporting research done on first-generation college students and lower-income college students, and research being conducted by first-generation college students who are now scholars at the graduate and professional levels. And so my goal is to begin to expand on that. How do we develop a program through the Newberry Center that will connect to the different schools at BU, like at the large College of Arts and Sciences, at Wheelock, and engineering, so that we can actually begin to support, again, those scholars who are first in their families to go to college, but then also those who are doing stuff that reduces the inequality or the gaps that first generation college students experience while they are in school. Because to me, we need more informed scholarship that is aimed at more than just putting policy in a single paragraph at the end of a paper. Like, we want to be able to support people and give them the time to conduct groundbreaking research and actually publish it, and get the word out, and not be afraid to say, yes, I want to actually write an op-ed. I actually want to write a book that's more accessible. Like, how do I do that? How can I invest that extra semester of doing the hard work of writing accessibly instead of just the other 5 other people who are studying the same subfield that I am? And so that's one of my goals, is to support research. And how do we build out the research arm? Because the student facing arm is strong. And to me, when we start to grow by expanding staff and the space of the center, it will be even stronger. Because if Maria was able to do what she was able to do with the staff that she has now, I am excited to work alongside her with additional staff members to make sure that students at BU have a resource that can support them, and actually push offices to be more knowledgeable about their experiences, from study abroad to counseling to summer research. And that's some of the things that we will begin to do. But one thing that we're excited about is actually working with other centers across the country, right? More and more centers, universities are adopting first generation college student centers or the equivalent. For example, Duke University just did, to me, the private school version of the Carolina Covenant that started at the University of North Carolina, where now states, in the wake of affirmative action, are saying, well, private universities say we're going to double down and recruit across our state, especially from disadvantaged neighborhoods, whether they be urban or rural. And that's how we're going to get our diversity, because we can't use race anymore as a factor. But the thing is, okay, that's what you're doing on the front end. This is what you're doing on the recruitment process. What's going to happen the day after convocation? And that's what my research is always going to be about. It's okay, you want to focus on who goes where. I'm trying to figure out the experiences of those once they get there, because there's a lot of life that is lived between convocation and commencement. So to me, the Newberry Center gives me that perch of being able to engage with larger outside community, but also making sure that the home community is also listening to the very research that other universities are flying us out to talk about.
There are several questions in the Q&A, and I have a couple left over, but I'm going to jump to those first because I think there are people who are eager to hear. You mentioned the Newberry Center, the goal, your goal of complementing the student-facing work that Maria and her team have been working on. Are there initiatives in the works at the Newberry Center to get more faculty and staff involved in the Newberry Center, more engaged in the work?
Yes, so there is a number of different initiatives, and there's ways in which you can get trained. So now that we are a first Gen 4 institution and participate, Maria and the team, we lead a first Gen training so that you can be an ambassador and a support. And there's, I'm sure that Megan could put a link to the program, but it's a way of also identifying which faculty members at BU are first Gen, and being part of like Tri Alpha Society and different things like that. But then also anybody who wants to be trained to be an ambassador for first generation college students can participate in that program. And of course, you can get a decal for your door to be able to highlight to students that you've taken this, to me, affirmative step to say, I'm part of creating an inclusive campus. And I've at least taken this step to understand the issues that face first generation college students. In the same way, I hope that there can be additional trainings to account for a whole host of different identities and experiences that the university, that our students bring.
So if I could kind of capture what I think you're putting an emphasis on here, is helping build relationships between first generation students and faculty and staff. Absolutely. So that the faculty and staff understand what that relationship needs to look like in order to help those students be more successful and access the resources. Is that fair?
Yes.
Terrific. I met a young professional at the University of Pennsylvania last week, and I invited him to join the webinar, and he put a question in the Q&A. So I'm excited. Benjamin Hughes asks whether or not there's room in your research to focus on the experience or support for first generation professionals, faculty, staff, and alumni who are in those same elite spaces.
Yeah, so that's actually really, that's actually something that we are thinking about, especially me as a researcher too, is, I've been focusing mostly on the K through 12 space, but I'm part of the American Sociological Association Task Force for First Gen and Working Class Sociologists. And we actually just published a paper about the graduate school pipeline and how social class continues to shape how people move through the academy. And we're also doing work on what is the experience of being a first gen faculty member. There's a lot of work right now on the Black, Pink, and Rainbow tax. And by the Black, Pink, and Rainbow tax, we mean the disproportionate amount of service work that faculty of color, women, and queer faculty do on behalf of the university that does not count for promotion or any kind of way towards their own mobility. And what's important about understanding that work is it has disproportionately been focusing on visible identity markers for the most part, not always, but social class gets missed out on sometimes about the personal experience. And so there is work by Elizabeth Lee and Debbie Warnock and others that that focuses on and looks at the experiences of first gen and working class people in the academy. But that's now where some of the research is going. There is a bias towards the college years, partially because it's so much of a stepping stone to your career. But there is new research that is going on, and I'm writing a paper with Elizabeth Lee about the experiences of first gen, how social class deepens the inequalities that are experienced by faculty of color and especially women. And the paper that I believe that Megan put in there is about the graduate school pipeline, how social class continues to shape that.
That's great. Ben, reach out to Tony directly. I'm sure he'd love to have further conversation with you about your interest.
Absolutely.
So, Tony, there's a couple of questions that relate to high school seniors. Our team in Upward Bound here at BU Wheelock, but another question, anonymous question, came about guidance counselors and school counselors. What advice can you give, a couple of pieces of advice, if you will, for high school seniors who want to get into college or university that you might refer to as elite, or for that matter, any college or university, because many of these systems have the same challenges? And how might you advise school counselors to help those students prepare for the kinds of things that you experience and that you're trying to address at the Newberry Center?
Yeah, I mean, that's the hard part, because it's hard to measure someone's dedication to a job and say, well, you have to get someone into this type of school without acknowledging the context. When I was at my public high school, which was an IB AP school, they just split the class in half. There were two college counselors, and anyone whose name started before JE, you had Mrs. Inskeep, and anybody after, you had the other person. And that was it. When I switched to my private school, I think each person had like 12 people, 12 to 15 people. They had an entire suite of people who were just there, dedicated to getting people into college. So you have to acknowledge the structure, the inequality in schools. Before I say anything about what guidance counselors should and should not do, I want to recognize that fact first and foremost.
Good point.
And for what's important to me is, I want to say apply. A lot of times we shut the door on opportunities before they even have a chance to say anything to us. Like, yeah, you actually are pretty good. No, we just immediately say no. I think we have to get into apply mentality. And the thing is, it's easier to apply to school now than it was when I was applying. When I was applying, they still could literally fit all the names of the common application schools at the top of the header. Now it's so many that it will literally take up an entire page at like 8-point font. You have to apply and get people to into the mentality of apply for everything unless it says X name can't apply. Just get into the habit of putting yourself out there, because that's going to be a lifelong skill. It is going to be something that you will be doing for the rest of your life, whether you go in the academy and applying for grants, or whether you're going to be finding a job and applying for a whole bunch of different things. It doesn't matter. Putting yourself out there and being your own advocate is incredibly important. And even framing it like that, you're not framing it just as I'm going to school, like framing it as a life lesson of being able to advocate for yourself. And quite frankly, a lot of lower income students don't get a lot of practice advocating for yourself, because so many times we are told we have to be quiet, we have to do our work, we have to be barely seen, but definitely not heard. Like just do, you know, that kind of interactions where it, to me, even at, you know, even now, sometimes speaking up in certain situations, I have to tell myself to do it rather than just do it, because I have to like still get over that, you know, some of the experiences that I had in my own life. Um, the one thing I will also say is we need to involve families in a different sort of way. And I don't know the best practice for it, but I wish colleges stopped treating orientation like country club visits for rich families. And I wish they stopped treating college application as like a family affair, like a it's gonna be like this family thing that they do. We actually need to do a lot more work explaining the process and making a better case for higher education than we are doing right now. Because right now, it's like this zero sum, if you don't get into a top 10 school, you're never going to make it kind of mentality. And that's just not true, right? No matter what economists you read, they will always say people who have an associate's degree make less than a bachelor's. People who have a bachelor's, generally speaking, make less in lifetime earnings people who have a master's. And then for terminal MBA, JD, MD, right? The research is still there. And I'm not saying that's the case that you make more money, but we have to do a much better job at making the case for higher education that is attuned to, or at least accounts for, some of the worries, fears, but also desires that families have for and about their children. And that's something I think guidance counselors can be that in between. But I think universities have to support guidance counselors more than just that fact sheet, or some of the, you know, oh, we'll send you a banner or something like that. There's a lot of stuff that needs to be rethought. And I know that Mandy Savage Romer, who focuses on guidance counselors and things like that, has done work on this. But the inequality of the pandemic, the way in which the inequality that was exacerbated by the pandemic, and the still lack of investment in public K through 12 education is only broadening the gaps. And it's not just the gap. Again, it's not the real gap is not between a good public and a bad public, or urban public and a suburban public. The gap between public and private is ridiculous. There's one boarding school that literally has a rule that every guidance counselor has to have the same exact demographic breakout across the school, so that no one person specializes in athletes and legacies and musicians and artists. When you have to put rules like that in place, that's how much time you have on your hands.
Yeah.
That's how privileged of an environment that you are. When you are at my school separating class by you get the first 650 and I get the next 650. That's a big difference.
Yeah, you bring up a point that sort of highlights an earlier question that someone had about the doubly disadvantaged student that you have sort of defined in your work. And, you know, a student who's coming maybe valedictorian of their class, but from a high school that is a typical public high school or a low public high school. How do we support them? And because it's a very different, as you pointed out at the top of the conversation, it's a very different kind of experience for them.
I mean, we saw this with the Boston valedictorian study, right? And for those of you who don't remember, you should really look up. The Globe did an amazing piece. They were actually nominated for the Pulitzer because of the writing. So a couple years ago, Boston kind of wanted to pat itself on its back, like, where are our valedictorians? Where are our best and our brightest? You know, a state that invests heavily in education, in a city that invests heavily in education. Let's see where our valedictorians are. And what they found was a few were doing very well, but the vast majority were struggling.
Mm.
And part of that was because Boston is a highly segregated city, right? Just because you're valedictorian doesn't mean that you have the same set of experiences if you live in Newton or Brookline or some of these other places where they mirror BU and Harvard and Wesleyan and Tufts, right? And they felt like fishes out of water. And that's why I say it's not an academic thing, because even people who have shown the work, right? Yeah, they saw a difference between students who went to Boston Latin and students who went to other schools, and how much they persevered and things like that. And that called in the whole question of, are exam schools equitable? But even people who do the work, it's the social side of academic life that trips them up. I think universities should revamp orientation. I think universities should rethink faculty orientation as well. I think there are ways in which we need to incentivize people at the universities to mentor and advise who the university is now, not who the university was 50 years ago. So if your lab still looks exactly the same, predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly wealthy, and you're in this, especially in the sciences, right, which is disproportionately the case, and your lab really has not changed from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, or 70s compared to today, that's problematic. And yet those are people who get promoted, they don't do as much service work and all this kind of stuff. How do we make sure that we're not letting that happen? And so even when you have valedictorians from across the country who come in with 5 or 6 AP, and they have an IB diploma, and they have language citations and 2 languages and things like that, and they're so eager, and then you get here and they struggle. It's not because, I mean, calculus is calculus, right? Epsilon delta proof is an epsilon delta proof no matter where you are. Beethoven is Beethoven and Bach is Bach. But when you teach in such a way, or the dorms are organized in such a way, or there's shorthand for everything, and you don't take a step to say, okay, I'm going to introduce you to all of this first before we just jump right in, you will always leave out those students. If universities continue to privilege, we will still truly hurt the disadvantaged, period.
I need to wrap up because we're coming near the end. For those of you who wrote questions in the Q&A that we haven't answered, I will try to respond to some of them myself. But Tony, as we close, I'd like you to, we're very excited about your new book coming out, and it's talked about here, When Campus Closed. I'm also interested in what you're going to do next. So sorry, the ink hasn't dried yet on this book. But what's the next initiative Tony Jack is going to focus on?
I think I have to grapple with writing about the thing I hate researching and talking about the most, and that actually is affirmative action. It requires so much energy of me, because it brings up so many negative experiences of being called an affirmative action baby and all these kind of things like that, to look at affirmative action not from the perspective of getting in, but the affirmative action from the experience of those who lived it through these days of campus. And so I think for me, reflect whether it's through a book comprised of essays or something more autobiographical, that I have to really grapple with this and bring in the lessons learned from these 2 book projects, that hopefully I can synthesize it and write it in a truly conversational, let's have, conversational way to be able to engage it. But also I have a number of articles that I'm working on with graduate students that I'm really excited about, because it's to work with people who are the next generation who will shape the academy is particularly exciting. So I'm learning more about settler colonialism with my student who wants to study Native and Indigenous students. I'm learning even more about morality and its dynamic for help seeking. So I'm learning alongside and from the next generation. So the articles that I write will be partly on that as well.
Wonderful. And I have been privileged to see you in action with some of your students. So I know that you take that mentorship very, very seriously. If you didn't get a chance to see, Tony was featured in an article in the New York Times about the Supreme Court decision this summer related to race-based admissions processes. So you can always look for it on the New York Times as well. Tony, thank you so much for sharing this time with us this afternoon. There is a webinar recording of this. It will be on our the BU Wheelock YouTube channel. So be sure to point people to it if they weren't able to join us. I want to make sure that we have those of you who are on the call have access to both the academic program Tony's associated with, the Higher Education Administration, but also to contacts for the Newberry Center so that you can learn more about their work. And then I just want to thank everyone and invite you to upcoming events at the turn of the year. In January, we'll have yet another discussion with the dean focusing on anti-racist scholarship in higher ed institutions, featuring Doctors Kayleen Stevens and Jerry Whitmore Jr. So very excited about that conversation. And you see a QR code that will lead you to additional information about future webinars. So Tony, again, thank you. Great to see you. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with the group.
Thank you again. Talk to you soon.
Terrific. Good afternoon, everyone.